You know, in New York, there is a gate that, just by standing in front of it, can make people feel a chill crawl up their spine. Not because of the wind, but because right there, at that very spot, a music icon known across the world fell on the sidewalk, in full view of strangers. The Guardian. And the thing that has haunted me most through 20 years of tracing Manhattan's historical fingerprints is this. Everything, all the glamour and all the shadow that clings to that gate, began with something that sounds almost laughably ordinary, a sewing machine. Not a gun, not Hollywood, not glittering parties, just the steady click of needle and thread that changed how people dressed, worked, and built wealth. Then, by a strange twist of fate, that wealth helped raise a luxurious fortress that people would both crave and fear. Encyclopedia Britannica. People once called this building a madness, a waste, a joke planted in a wasteland. Back then, they would glance toward Central Park West and sneer. Out there, too far, too windy, empty land, nothing but mud and space. They laughed at an idea that sounded like betrayal. The richest people in the city, the kind who shut their townhouse doors and lived inside private worlds, were being asked to give it up and live under one roof with strangers. But just a few years later, that madness turned into desire. Waiting lists grew, rumors spread. People stopped asking who would be reckless enough to live there and started asking who is worthy of stepping through that gate. And tonight I want you to come with me to the end of one question. Why did a building once mocked become an immortal symbol of New York, powerful enough to lure the ultra-rich, pull in Hollywood, and then stand as witness to a tragedy that stunned the world into silence? Go back to 1884. At the corner of 72nd Street, beside Central Park West, a massive structure rose, more fortress than home. And do not picture New York as it is today. Late 19th century Manhattan still had areas seen as the edge of civilization. One patch was muddy, another felt deserted. Streetlights were not yet dense enough to make people less afraid of darkness. Yet in that landscape, one man believed the future would push people closer together, not through affection, but through the pressure of land, population, and money. His name was Edward Cabot Clark, not an artist, not a storyteller. He was the kind of man who turns history with contracts, numbers, and cold clarity. The Dakota was built for Clark, designed by architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg, constructed from 1880 to 1884, and it remains among the earliest luxury apartment buildings still standing in New York. But to understand Clark, we have to turn to a name both celebrated and scandal-stained. Isaac Merritt Singer, tied to the Singer sewing machine brand. A man who turned a mechanical invention into a money-printing engine. Singer was not the only person to create a sewing machine, but he was the one who made it a product that could enter everyday life, and more importantly, a business empire. Then Singer's private life flared like a match on oilcloth. Tangled relationships, accusations, the story of multiple families, so many children that people hardly knew whether to call it tragedy or farce. Some sources record that Singer had dozens of children, and his personal scandals once shook public opinion. And here is where history turns sharp. While Singer stirred the storm, the man who kept the business machine from collapsing was none other than Edward Clark, the key partner who helped make the enterprise run smoothly. Clark did not see the future by instinct. He saw it as an equation. If sewing machines entered households, cash would enter pockets, and when cash grew large enough, it would flow into real estate, the thing New York always hungers for. The Guardian. That is why the sewing machine in this story is not just a tool, it is a key that opened the vault of an era. From an invention for stitching, people gained money. From money, they bought land. From land, they bought power. And the Dakota, frankly, was a declaration of power made of brick and stone. Why did people call it madness? Location, psychology. At the time, the Upper West Side was still seen as too far, too sparse, too quiet. One tale says the name Dakota captured the sense that it was far to the northwest compared with bustling Manhattan. Another view suggests Clark liked frontier names and once proposed naming avenues after Western territories, but the idea was not accepted. Either way, the meaning was the same. It was considered outside the center of wealthy life. But Clark did not build to please the crowd. He built to strike the most private fear of the elite: chaos. As the city swelled, immigrants arrived. Noise and risk crept toward the doorstep. The wealthy did not just want beauty. They wanted safety. They wanted discretion. They wanted distance that could not be touched. So the Dakota was designed as a luxury fortress, large-scale, enclosed, with a courtyard that made it feel separate from the street, even while standing beside Central Park. It did not sell an apartment, It sold the feeling that you were stepping into another world. And that madness won, because it arrived ahead of the era's mindset. The Dakota became the place where the rich accepted living under one roof, as long as the roof was thick enough to block the noise of life, luxurious enough to elevate status, and private enough to protect secrets. Over the years, it became the name that artists, directors, and stars sought out, because New York has a strange magnetism, both showy and lonely, loud and yet desperate for refuge. But there is a harsh truth. When a place becomes a symbol, it does not only draw lights, it draws shadows, too. That gate, in the end, was not just an entrance to fame. It became a boundary between an ordinary day and a historical moment. John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota, and from then on, for many people, that gate stopped being architecture. It became a cut in collective memory. The Guardian. And now, before we step into that night, I want you to hold one question in your mind. If you were Edward Clark, would you dare build a fortress in a place people mocked, gamble reputation and money, just to force the rich to change how they live? Because sometimes, what creates a symbol is also what opens the door to tragedies no one can predict. Chapter 1. 1. A genius and a force of chaos. In the history of 19th century American industry, there are inventions powerful enough to reshape how people live. And there are also people who, the moment they enter a room, change the air itself. They draw eyes, spark ideas, push the wheel of the era forward, and at the same time, tear apart their own lives with their bare hands. Isaac Merritt Singer was that kind of person. He had a hard-to-explain charisma, mechanical talent, and a gift for persuading others to believe in what they had never seen. But his private life was like a storm ripping through a neighborhood. Tangled affairs, multiple households, thickening rumors, and secrets that a morally strict society could not forgive. I am not telling this to sensationalize. I am telling it because that chaos, yes, that very mess, created a quiet turning point. And from that turning point, the Dakota was born. Some histories do not begin with war or politics. They begin with one man who cannot control himself, and another man cold enough to control everything else. 1.2. 11 days that changed an industry. A story has been passed around. Singer took a bit more than a week, some say 11 days, to produce a new sewing machine prototype. A machine that ran smoother, stitched continuously, handled curves better, and moved so fast, it stunned people of the time. Imagine an era when much was still done by hand, when needlework was repetitive labor that numbed the body. A machine that could swallow fabric and release perfectly even stitches was not just convenient, it was a punch to the old order. Even if the hour-by-hour details vary by source, one thing is certain, that machine opened a new age of production. Sewing was no longer chained to the speed of hands, but to gears and levers. And once speed changed, everything changed with it. Cost, commerce, and the dreams of ordinary families. But Singer was not good at building an empire. He was good at creating lightning. He surged, swerved, invented, and then burned himself down with personal choices. His machine could run steadily, his life could not. And that is why he needed a complete opposite. 1.3. The man of order, Edward Clark. Edward Clark was a lawyer, a man of contracts, ledgers, and discipline. He was not loud. He did not need applause. He was the type who hears a bold idea and does not ask, does it sound good? But how do we turn it into cash flow? And how do we keep that cash flowing? If Singer was a storm, Clark was the seawall. They partnered. And from that partnership came an idea that sounds familiar today, but was revolutionary then: installment payments. Sewing machines were not cheap. For most families, especially a rising middle class, the machine was like a dream behind glass, beautiful to look at, impossible to touch. Clark understood a cold truth. The market did not lack desire, it lacked a path to purchase. He broke the price into smaller pieces. He turned impossible into possible. And when a middle-class woman could bring the machine home, it was not just a sale. It changed the rhythm of life. Faster sewing, more efficient work, the chance to earn more, save more, and above all, the belief that she was stepping into the future. The market exploded. Money poured in like a waterfall, and when money pours like a waterfall, it always seeks a basin to become a deep lake. Something safer, more durable, more respectable. But right at the peak, Singer's private life began to collapse like a stage on fire. 1.4. A scandal erupts and the price of fame. In the end, tangled relationships were exposed, the press swarmed, society was outraged. Back then, reputation was not just image, it was a key to the most powerful salons. When that key snapped in public view, everything shook. Singer left the United States for England. He died with enormous wealth for the era, leaving a legacy both dazzling and bitter. A man who created something that helped millions stitch a future, yet could not stitch the tears in his own life. And what about Clark? Clark, the man of order, did not chase the storm. He stayed. He stood in the ashes of scandal and did what men like him do: hold on to what matters most. Not emotion, not fame, control. The operating system, the capital, enough capital to challenge New York's way of life. And here's the hook I want you to hold tight. Clark did not just want to build housing. He wanted to rebuild how the rich lived. He wanted a place where the elite could live together while still feeling separate. A fortress in a swelling city, where honor was protected by thick walls and status confirmed by a gate. But to do it, Clark had to choose a location everyone mocked, and dare to bet that the mocked spot would become the center of desire. And from here, the real question begins. Why did the Dakota, a madness at the edge of civilization, become a symbol that made all New York look up and then made the whole world weep? Chapter 2. The Mocked Idea. 2.1. New York's Rich Hated Apartments. Back then, the word apartment did not sound elegant in New York. It conjured cramped rooms, noise, smoky kitchens, messy corridors, doors opening and closing like a marketplace. An apartment was what people accepted when they had no other choice, not what they showed off as a status symbol. The upper class lived in townhouses, their homes lined up like boxes of power. Private doors, private gates, private stoops, carriages waiting outside, servants moving in and out by ritual. Each house was its own world, where honor was protected by distance and wealth was proven by privacy. So, asking them to share one roof with strangers was not just a proposal. It felt like an insult. As if you were saying their status could be diluted, their privacy traded away, their ego forced to stand next to someone else's in the same hallway. But Edward Clark did not look at New York through habit. He looked through rules. He had studied Europe, and that was the crucial touch. In Paris, London, Vienna, the rich lived in large buildings and still lived with elegance, discretion, and dignity. There, living in one building did not mean living crowded. It could be a symbol of urban civilization. Many residences, but each one a real space, ordered, layered, with boundaries. Clark understood. New York would have to become like that. Not because the rich wanted to change, but because the city would force them. Population was rising, land was expensive, the center was growing dense, and individual townhouses would become a luxury so extreme it would be irrational. The future would push them in one direction. The only question was who would go first and turn that direction into class instead of decline. The issue was not, are apartments elegant? The issue was, who had the nerve to make the elite believe that living in a shared building could be the sign of a new class? And Clark asked the most dangerous business question of all. If the future is certain to arrive, do I dare to be the one who opens the door? 2. Choosing a place, as far as the frontier. Once he decided, Clark did what made the city roar with laughter. He chose a location people saw as the wild edge. West of the park, where land was still open, small farms mixed with neglected lots, amenities were scarce, streets were unfriendly, and many looked at it as unfamiliar territory. You must understand New York psychology then. The center was where people wanted to belong, and far was for those without enough money or connections. Choosing a far place to build luxury sounded like smearing your own name. So laughter came as reflex. They mocked him. They called the project Clark's Folly, the kind of folly people believed existed only to prove that even a rich man could be wrong. They told the story with half-joking contempt. He is building a castle where nobody goes. Those jokes did not need evidence, because they rested on something stronger than evidence, the crowd's habit. And the name Dakota grew from that teasing. Not because it belonged to the Dakota territory, but because people wanted to say it was as far as the frontier. So far it felt outside Manhattan's map of luxury. When a project gets a nickname, it often carries a verdict. This does not belong here. But Clark did not argue with words. He argued with calculation. Clark had counted something others did not count enough: transportation. The city never stands still. Elevated rail lines, new connections, shifting infrastructure. Those are arteries that pump people and money into areas mocked today. The crowd judged location with today's feet, far. Clark judged it with tomorrow's wheels, soon close. He imagined a day when you could leave the center, ride the train, and within a short time step out beside the park. Then far would become spacious. Wild would become quiet. And quiet beside Central Park in a loud city would become something people would pay dearly for. That is the frightening moment when a real businessman reveals himself. He does not sell what exists, he sells what people will crave. And when his belief grew strong enough, he did the next thing that would turn mocked idea into irreplaceable symbol. He did not build a building. He built a fortress to protect the elite from street noise, a fortress to protect honor from curious eyes, a fortress to turn living together into living above a new social tier. From here, the story changes tone. From a mock decision to a structure that made people fall silent and look up. Because when Clark laid the first brick, he did not just lay the foundation of the Dakota. He bet that New York would change what it meant by class. Chapter 3. Hardenberg's Fortress. 3.1. A young architect and an impossible mission. Once Edward Clark chose to make apartment living desirable, he understood that persuasion was meaningless if the building was not strong enough to silence people. So he gave the task to Henry Janeway Hardenberg, still fairly young, but already proven, not only by steady lines, but by the ability to create feeling, not just walls. Clark told him one simple sentence, with the weight of an order: do not spare money. It sounded like waste, but for Clark it was strategy. He was not building to economize. He was building to strike the elite psyche. If you want the rich to leave townhouses for apartments, you must give them a reason so powerful they do not feel they are stepping down. Hardenberg understood the impossible mission. He did not design a communal housing block. He designed a symbol, something that, even from afar, made people stop. Not because it was gently pretty, but because it had weight, shadow, and a story hanging in the air on every brick. He answered Clark with a façade New York could not ignore. A European castle rising in Manhattan, sloped roofs, projecting ledges, deep windows, walls that let light slide rather than cling. It was both splendid and dark, both inviting and warning. A beauty that has a story, the kind that makes you not only look, but ask, what kind of life is inside? And this is what always fascinates me. Hardenberg did not only create a structure, he created instinct. You stand before it and feel smaller. That feeling is not accidental. It is a power technique. The more the building overwhelms you, the more you believe the residents belong to a class you cannot easily reach. 3.2. An entrance built for discretion. The detail that feels so understanding of the rich is not in the stonework or the ornate decoration. It is in something that seems small but decides everything: the entrance. Hardenberg designed an archway large enough for a carriage to pass through, bringing residents across the gate and straight into an inner courtyard, separated from the street as if crossing a second skin of the city. Do you see it? The key was not only beauty. The key was saving face and protecting privacy. The rich are not only afraid of poverty, they fear being looked at like ordinary people. They fear being touched by eyes, whispers, and the crowd's curiosity. That arch was a promise. You can come and go without performing for the street. It was a ritual. Outside, you still belong to noisy New York. But pass through the arch and you enter another world, a world where breathing slows, sound drops, and voices soften. This is New York luxury. Not necessarily showing off, sometimes it is the ability to disappear at the right moment. 3.3. Two parallel worlds, owners and staff. Inside the Dakota, Hardenberg organized space like a miniature social system. And this is historically important. The Dakota was not only housing, it was an operating machine. There were elevators and stairs for residents, and separate ones for staff. There were circulation paths for the front stage class, and separate paths for the backstage life, where cleaning, preparation, deliveries, and repairs happened without appearing before owners. This separation was not personal cruelty, it was the era's design. The elite did not want reminders that their comfort required a workforce. They wanted to step out of the parlor and feel the world still ran smoothly, as if by itself. Hardenberg understood that and translated it into architecture. Service ran like gears, while owners lived as if in a film that never reveals its backstage. So the system had one clear goal: make the rich feel they were not living together. They were living in a palace divided into many small palaces. Each apartment was not a room in a building. It was a domain protected by thick walls, corridors, ritual, and a mechanism that made meeting others a choice, not a requirement. But here the story turns practical, and that is the deciding question. How do you sell a palace like that? Building it is one thing, persuading the elite to pay and cross the boundary of habit is another. And at this point Clark would prove something people had to admit. He did not only build with bricks and stone, he built with psychology. Chapter 4. A Palace Under One Roof. 4.1. Selling a Feeling, Not Rooms. If you ask me why the Dakota won, I will not begin with materials. I will begin with one word: feeling. Edward Clark knew the elite do not buy square footage. They buy status. They buy reassurance. They buy the feeling, I belong somewhere others can only stare at from outside. So the Dakota was designed so that those moving from townhouses felt their class did not drop, it rose. Not by louder display, but by subtler power. You no longer needed your own gate to prove you were special, because the building's gate did it for you. You no longer needed a whole street to know your family name, because one address was enough to tell people what tier you belonged to. The apartments were large, and that mattered, but size alone does not change prejudice. What changed prejudice was service, staff, maintenance, amenities, a life that felt lighter than running a private household machine inside each townhouse. It sounded like convenience, but for the rich, it was a transformation of power. You still received service, but you did not have to carry the full exhaustion of organizing it. In other words, you were still the master, but you did not have to carry the fatigue of mastery. Clark understood a hard paradox. The elite want to be served, but they hate feeling entangled in the work that makes service possible. They want dinner to appear on time, but they do not want to hear the kitchen. They want cleanliness, but they do not want to see the machinery of clean. The Dakota turned all of that into a hidden flow, as if luxury simply existed on its own. So, when a family entered the Dakota, they did not feel they were moving house. They felt they were moving up a level. From owning the whole building to owning an experience. And that experience included something a townhouse could not easily buy as Manhattan grew denser: discretion. You could live near the center and still avoid eyes. You could live by the park and still keep the street out of the parlor. You could appear when you wanted and disappear when you needed. That is why Clark did not sell rooms. He sold a kind of peace reserved for people with money. 4.2. The bitter twist. The dream maker did not live inside the dream. History often plays a cruel game in silence. Edward Clark died before the building was finished. He never entered the Dakota as a resident. He never stood in the courtyard and heard the city outside shrink. He never felt the moment when a mocked idea became an object of desire. I have always found this moving. A man who saw farther than his era. A man who endured ridicule. A man who placed honor and money on the table and kept walking with cold reason, yet did not live long enough to see New York admit he was right. Some people are born to lay the first brick, but not to walk the completed road. And the ache is this: they are often misunderstood in life and praised after they fall silent. But do you know what happened the moment the Dakota opened? Not praise in newspapers, not apologies from those who mocked. Something more practical, and therefore undeniable. People poured in. The skeptics had to admit it. The folly had buyers. People were willing to wait. People treated the right to live there as a certificate. As the waiting list grew, yesterday's laughter turned into silence. In business, nothing refutes doubt more than a line of people waiting. In that moment, the Dakota completed what Clark pursued from the beginning. It did not exist only as a building. It existed as an idea, a new symbol of New York. Proof that living under one roof was no longer a downgrade, but could be a sign of a new era. An era where class was not measured by how many private doors you owned, but by whether you could step through a gate and leave the whole city behind. And from then, another thing began. When a place becomes a symbol, it does not only attract money, it attracts stories, it attracts names. It attracts people who want to live in the glow. And sometimes people who want to drag that glow down to the street. That is when we must move to the next chapter, where the Dakota meets the most dangerous thing every symbol meets: the attention of the whole world. Chapter 5. The joke becomes a coveted address. The Dakota filled quickly. Yesterday's laughter evaporated like mist in sunlight. People stopped calling it madness. They stopped repeating Clark's folly with sarcasm. In its place appeared a thing New York uses to crown what is desirable: the waiting list. As the waiting list stretched, you know what that means. Mockery becomes silence. Doubt becomes curiosity. And curiosity in New York is the first step toward craving. The Dakota proved something many wealthy people never want to admit. They can change habits if you give them a reason strong enough to believe they are not lowering status, but stepping into a new tier. A townhouse gives you the feeling, I own the whole house. The Dakota gives you the feeling, I belong to a fortress. And in a city growing louder, the feeling of protection can cost more than space. The strangest part is this: the Dakota outlived the people who came and went. It existed like a living thing with memory. It watched families arrive in pride and leave in silence. It watched generations change taste, clothing, spending. It watched New York change skin, Hoofbeats to engines, gaslight to electricity, handwritten letters to telephones, quiet evenings to lights that never turn off. Through all of it, the Dakota stood there like an old gatekeeper who does not need to speak much. Some buildings stop being real estate, they become symbols. And symbols have a strange power. Time passes, but cannot easily erase them. Then, the Dakota entered a larger game, not the residents' game, but the city's. As New York grew richer, land grew more expensive. And when land is expensive, people look at an old building with a cold question. Is it maximizing profit? That is the moment every heritage site faces. Not because it is ugly, not because it lacks function, but because it sits on land where profit can bend logic. And one day, the Dakota faced an enemy every historic building fears: excavators and profit. Excavators do not hate memory. They simply do not understand memory. They understand numbers, square feet. They understand how many floors and how many units, tear down and rebuild, can produce. Profit is like hunger. It does not care how long you have existed, it asks how much you can produce today. So the question was no longer, is the Dakota beautiful? The question became, does the Dakota hold enough power in New York's heart to be protected from hands that want to rip it into profit? Here, the story shifts into another battle. Heritage against the era. For a symbol to survive, it needs more than bricks. It needs people willing to stand in front of the machine of money. And if you think that battle is only paperwork, lawsuits, or zoning, wait. Because as the Dakota survived those years, it became a magnet for a special kind of person. Those who want to live inside a story, touch a symbol, and be protected by walls already used to resisting pressure. That is when the Dakota entered another era, the era of names. Names that make crowds look up, names that, simply by appearing, seem to light up the gate. And at that same time, the shadow began to grow, because every light drags a shadow behind it. Chapter 6. One weekend saves a legend. 6.1. When one family leaves, a building can die. There is a cold truth in urban history. Sometimes a building does not die of age. It dies when ownership changes hands. When a structure belongs to one family for decades, it feels like it has a steady breath, habits, care, a kind of attachment without words. But when ownership passes to an organization, everything starts being measured by the one yardstick: organization's trust, profit. So the Dakota was placed on the market like a commodity. A name, an address, a piece of land, an opportunity. In New York, opportunity can be a pretty word hiding a brutal act, using the old as foundation for the new. A real estate developer bought it, and the familiar intention in Manhattan rose like instinct. Tear down the old, build new. Tear down to go higher. Tear down to multiply profit. Tear down to turn memory into numbers. The Dakota, with thick walls and historical shadow, suddenly became a problem in some eyes. Not because it was weak, but because it occupied a prime spot and refused to become the maximum profit machine. That is when every heritage site trembles, when cultural value must answer, how much does it earn? 6.2. The fateful call and the cruel deadline. The news hit residents like a sentence, not the kind of news you have time to digest. The kind that makes you slump into a chair with a dry throat. They had only a few dozen hours, one weekend, to find a way to keep their home. Imagine that feeling. You have lived here your whole life. You know the sound of doors, the creak of the floor, the morning hallway smell, the sunlight through a particular window at a particular hour only you remember. Your memories are in every stair, every small scratch, every silence between thick walls. Then a stranger, with one sentence, can turn it all into rubble. We will demolish it. Many people cried, some panicked, some shook with anger, and the most frightening part was this: they were not only losing housing, they were about to lose part of identity. Because when you live in a place long enough, it stops being an address. It becomes part of your life. Yet in that moment of near despair, something rare formed: collective will, a shared feeling without slogans. They looked at each other and understood. If we want to keep living here, we must become the ones who save it. No one saves a building only because it is pretty. People save what they consider flesh and blood. 6.3. From tenants to owners. So they organized, met, calculated, negotiated. They raced time as if racing an excavator already warming up outside the door. Some put lifetime savings on the table. Some borrowed. Some accepted risk. Not because they craved ownership, but because they refused to be pushed out of their own memory. In the end, the Dakota was saved. But salvation comes with a promise heavy as stone. From now on, the residents would carry the responsibility of repairing, maintaining, and operating an aging fortress. Keeping a symbol alive is not romantic. It is bills, pipes, heating systems, and old walls that need care, like an elderly body. And it was also a collective adulthood. They were no longer only living inside history, they became the guardians of history. You think the storms ended there? No. Because when a building becomes a legend, it draws the spotlight. It draws names who want its discretion. It draws people whose presence alone makes the city turn its head. And when the light gathers too strongly in one place, the shadow gathers in its own way. Chapter 7. Hollywood finds the face of fear. A director was searching for a building that, with one look, would tell the audience something is happening. No blood needed, no screams. Just a shape standing still in frame, enough to make people wonder, what is being hidden there? And then he saw the Dakota. It was not flashy, not showy, yet the longer you looked, the more it felt like it was looking back. Windows like unblinking eyes, hallways like an unfinished story. And that oldness was not the luxury of a rich building, it was the age of secrets kept too long. From that moment, something strange happened. The Dakota was no longer only real estate, no longer only a place to live. It crossed an invisible line and became a character. When a place becomes a character, it gains a life of its own. It enters the lens, enters rumor, enters stories whispered in lower voices. Corners, stairs, frames can become props for millions of imaginations. And Hollywood is very good at one thing, taking silent emptiness and giving fear a shape. After cinema, the Dakota began to attract a special kind of person. People who live like art. Actors, musicians, celebrities, people with lights and stages who sometimes crave a place quiet enough to hear the noise inside themselves. The Dakota gave them that. It wore privacy like a mask. It offered safety and also mystery. And if you are famous, you learn an uncomfortable truth. What makes people most curious is not what you reveal, but what you hide. The Dakota was built to hide. And then, one day, a couple stepped through that door, not to rent an apartment, not only to live, but to turn the Dakota into a name the world would never forget. Chapter 8. The Home of Celebrities. Over time, the Dakota was no longer only expensive. It became a refuge, a place people sought not to show off, but to escape. Because those who live under the public gaze eventually crave the opposite, to be unseen. In New York, fame is like living in a glass room. Everywhere you go, there are voices calling your name, camera shutters, whispers, stories bent away from the truth. Artists came to love the Dakota for three very human reasons. It was discreet, it was separate, and it had history in every door, as if it had witnessed too much to bother judging you. People think famous places must be glamorous. But for the famous, the most precious thing is quiet. The Dakota understood that in its structure, the gate as boundary, the courtyard as cushion, corridors thick enough to swallow sound. Passing through the arch felt like stepping out of the crowd, even though the crowd was still right there. Then, in 1973, John Lennon and Yoko Ono arrived. Not the kind of arrival that walks a red carpet. The kind of arrival of a family trying to live, walking softly, speaking little, hoping the city would forget them for a while. They were met with suspicion, of course. Any celebrity entering a discreet place like the Dakota makes other residents worry. Noise, crowds, press that follows like a shadow. The Dakota was a fortress of privacy, so it did not easily open itself to people who bring a media storm with them. But the paradox, and what makes this story touch the heart, is this. They did not come to be seen, they came to disappear. Think about it. Lennon once stood inside the roar of tens of thousands. He lived at the peak of attention, where one voice could make the world listen. Yet behind it all, he longed for something painfully ordinary. A quiet evening, a corner of home, a meal not watched, a door that could close without anyone asking, "What are you doing?" And above all, the feeling of living like a normal person. Perhaps because he reached the extreme of spotlight, he understood its cost. Spotlight is beautiful, but it steals the right to be wrong, to be tired, to be silent. It turns every step into news, every sentence into a headline. And sometimes, the thing people want most is what money cannot buy, a life not shredded by other people's eyes. The Dakota gave them a silent promise, not a promise of perfect safety, because no place can promise that, but the promise of an old fortress. Here you can breathe slower. You can walk the hallways without acting. You can come home without being a symbol to strangers, just a father, a husband, a human being who needs peace. And that is why, when tragedy happened, it took people's breath away. Because if a person can live a lifetime in noise, and still have the courage to crave normal life, then the moment that normal life is taken away is not only an incident, It is a cut into the belief of millions that somewhere, even a little, there can be a corner that shields a human being from the world. And the most painful question appears next. What happened in front of that gate? A gate built to protect privacy, that became the place the world had to stand still. Chapter 9. A December night, and the gate that cannot forget. I will not tell this like breaking news. I will tell it like history, because it is a collective cut. There are moments, a single night, when a whole city suddenly realizes, no matter how crowded, New York can fall silent on the same beat. That night was a night in December 1980. John Lennon was returning home, not as a legend, but as a man who wanted to end the day by passing through a familiar gate, entering the courtyard, and closing the noisy world behind him. But at the entrance of the Dakota, a place designed to protect discretion, he was shot. In seconds, a life was stopped, and the history of world music was cut off at a doorstep. The pain of this story is not fame, it is the ordinary life he was trying to touch. A man who once stood in the roar of thousands chose a place to disappear, and then that wish to disappear was stolen. So when the news spread, people did not only lose an artist, they lost a gentle illusion that a private corner could exist where the world does not rush in. The Dakota still stood, the bricks did not fall, the arch still opened like any day, but from that moment, the building carried a grief that could not be removed. Some buildings, before becoming witnesses, are simply places to live. But when history happens on a doorstep, the building stops being an address. It becomes shared memory. Each time people mention it, they remember not only architecture, but the feeling of a throat tightening. And then, across the street in the park, a memory was created, so no one had to hold that grief alone. Central Park, once a place New Yorkers ran to escape concrete and horns, became a place people ran to place a flower, a whisper, a minute of silence. Central Park Conservancy. People call it Strawberry Fields, a living memorial, memory that breathes rather than stone that freezes. It sits near the Central Park West entrance around 72nd Street, close to where Lennon was shot outside the Dakota. At the center is a mosaic circle with one word: imagine. There is something beautiful about Strawberry Fields. It does not force you to say the right thing. You can come in silence, you can sit without explanation. Its meaning is not ritual, but sharing. Grief becomes bearable when you know you are not the only one carrying it. Central Park Conservancy. And if you look closely, history always has a strange balance. A place built to give the rich privacy, the Dakota, became the point the whole world looked at. And a place open to everyone, Central Park, became the place people found privacy inside themselves, standing near one another without needing to touch. But the question remains, and it hurts slowly. Why could a fortress of privacy not prevent tragedy right at the gate? And after tragedy, what made the Dakota survive not only as a building, but as a symbol, a place where light and shadow keep returning? Because from here, the story does not end. It shifts into another chapter, where memory, fame, and human obsession wrap around each other at the gate New York can never forget. Chapter 10. Strawberry Fields, where memory breathes. Strawberry Fields was created as a memorial of peace, but not the cold monument that makes you stand, look, and leave. It is a pause placed inside New York's rushing heartbeat, where anyone can sit down, breathe, and remember, without being forced to speak correctly. Here, memory is not framed in stone. It lives with leaves, footsteps, and wind, moving through the park like quiet comfort. Something unusual happens here. People arrive without planning and still meet. Some bring flowers, some bring only a tired face. Some sit as if they have carried a heavy day. Some, though they never met John Lennon, still stand silent for a long time, as if seeing off a loved one. Because sometimes we mourn not only a person, but a piece of faith inside ourselves. Here there is one word. Not long, not ornate, yet strong enough to make people lower their voices, slow down, and feel their throat tighten. Imagine. One word, yet it opens an inner sky. Imagine a world with less violence. Imagine peace as normal, not luxury. Imagine humans living side by side without hurting each other to prove existence. You do not have to be a Beatles fan to understand the power. Imagine no longer belongs only to Lennon. It belongs to those who come here and ask, if something beautiful can be stolen at a doorstep, what do we still keep? And you will see the strangest thing in this whole story. The Dakota and Strawberry Fields face each other across one road like two halves of an open book. One side is the building, a fortress of privacy and thick-walled lives. The other is the park, open space anyone can enter, no invitation, no identity, no status. One side is everyday life, coming home, passing the gate, closing the door, cooking, rocking a child to sleep. The other side is memory, sitting, looking up at trees, giving grief a place to rest. Only a road separates them, yet sometimes it feels like a much larger invisible distance, the distance between life continuing and memory refusing to disappear. New Yorkers pass daily. Some walk fast, as if they do not want to look long. Some glance for a second and bow their heads. Some stop, as if reminding themselves that in a city built on ambition, there is still a corner for gentleness. But New York history does not stop at emotion. There is always another layer beneath every beautiful story: power, money, and selection. Ask yourself, what allows a place like the Dakota to exist through decades while countless buildings are erased by excavators? What makes one address untouchable, while the whole city is constantly rewritten by cash flow? New York loves memory, yes, but New York also loves profit with cold intensity. Sometimes what is preserved is not only because it is beautiful, but because it is tied to a class strong enough to protect it. Strawberry Fields is memory open to all, but the Dakota, the home across the road, is memory with a gate. That gate does not only block noise, it blocks arbitrariness. It reminds you that some places, even inside the city, still belong to another world, a world not everyone can enter. From here, the story shifts tone, from sorrow to a sharper question. When a place becomes a symbol, who has the right to live inside the symbol? Who gets to pass through the gate and call it home? And what decides that selection? Morality, history, or the ability to pay? Because from this point, the Dakota is not only a backdrop for tragedy, it becomes something New York constantly produces, a symbol wrapped in power. And once power appears, it pulls in other stories. Who is allowed in? Who is rejected? Who is viewed with suspicion? And why a place built to disappear from the crowd becomes something the crowd cannot stop staring at. That is when we must move into the next chapter, where the story is no longer only tears and flowers on stone. It becomes the story of rules, gates, and how a legend protects itself, sometimes with choices that feel harsh. Chapter 11. From heritage to an exclusive fortress. Over time, the Dakota became more than a beautiful building or an expensive address. It was recognized as a landmark, given titles and legal protection. From that moment, it stepped into another role, not only where people live, but what New York keeps, to prove the city has memory, history, and things that excavators cannot easily swallow. But history always has two faces. When a place is protected, it is also framed. And once framed, it stops being ordinary space. It becomes a symbol. And in New York, symbols rarely belong to the many. They drift toward power, money, and rules written to keep the symbol from mixing into everyday life outside. So alongside its heritage status, the Dakota became one of the hardest addresses to enter. Not only because of price, but because the right to approve residence belongs to the building's board, a mechanism with an old urban flavor. Who steps in, who stays outside, sometimes decided not by city law, but by a closed community's own rules. Many famous people were rejected, and what confuses people is not that rejection exists, but that the reasons are almost never clearly spoken. No sign saying why, no straight answer. Only silence, the kind of silence that tells you power does not need to explain. Power only needs to close the door. You can dislike that, but through a historian's lens, it reflects an old rule of big cities. The more legendary a place becomes, the more fences it grows. Legend draws crowds, and fences are how legend shields itself from its own magnetism. To keep privacy, they built law. To keep quiet, they built rules. And to protect image, they were willing to say no, even to names everyone knows, because to them, the issue is not how famous or rich you are. The issue is, will you make this fortress louder? Will you pull the spotlight right up to the gate? Will you turn the courtyard into a reluctant stage? This touches the Dakota's greatest contradiction. It was built so the rich could disappear from the crowd, yet over time it became the very thing the crowd could not stop watching. Once a place carries collective memory, it no longer belongs only to residents. It belongs to millions of imaginations, and those imaginations always want to get closer, see clearer, touch more. So the board behaved like gatekeepers of a legend. They believed that if they loosened even a little, the legend would be worn down by the most ordinary forces: noise, curiosity, and the people waiting outside just to catch one celebrity stepping out. You may not like it, but you can understand their fear. The Dakota did not only witness New York's rise and fall, it stood at the site of a tragedy. And since then, every vibration around that gate has felt more sensitive than normal. For them, quiet is not only comfort, quiet is a form of survival. And if you ask me, someone who has read files, articles, memoirs, and documents about it for 20 years, the most memorable thing about the Dakota is not its price. It is that it survived. It survived mockery. It survived the greed of tear down and rebuild. It survived shifts of ownership and power. It survived decades of New York erasing and rewriting itself. And most of all, it survived as a reminder that sometimes a building can become bigger than its function. A box of memory, a gate of story, a place that stands still so we can feel time moving. Because history does not only live in books, sometimes it stands on a sidewalk, in a gate, in a courtyard, in the word imagine across the road. And the Dakota, whether you love or hate its closed nature, remains one of the rare places where you can feel that with your skin. Some things have passed through too much to vanish. That is why it deserves to be remembered. Chapter 12, Ending. A building that lives like a person. The Dakota was once a joke, then a dream. It was almost erased from the map, then rescued by the very people who called it home. In the end, it became a strange crossroads, between history and the present, between art and money, between privacy and the public gaze. Some places no longer belong to a single time, because too many times have stacked on top of each other. To touch it is to touch many layers of human life, many generations, many habits that vanished but left their traces. If you stand before that archway today, you will see tourists stop and fall quiet for a few seconds, not because they know every architectural detail, but because they feel a layer of time breathing there. A place where New York, a city that always rushes, suddenly lets itself slow down. I often think a building is like a person. It has youth when people laugh at it. It has maturity when people crave it. It has scars, days that make the throat tighten just to remember. And it has a survival instinct, sometimes through law, sometimes through money, and sometimes through the stubborn affection of those who lived inside it and treated it as part of their body. The Dakota has watched New York change its face. It has watched a city swallow the old to birth the new, then turn back and hold a few old fragments as if afraid of forgetting who it used to be. And it stands there as an answer without words. Some things do not need to be loud to exist. They only need to be strong enough that time cannot break them. Across the street, Strawberry Fields remains open, living memory where people can sit, breathe, and remember. Between the two places is only a road, but sometimes it feels like the border between two human needs that never die. A place to live in peace, and a place to grieve without being alone. So if you ask me what the Dakota is, I will not answer with architectural definition. I will say, the Dakota is a reminder. In a city where everything can be turned into a price, there are still things that cannot be fully measured by money. There are places whose value lies in what they have passed through, what they have endured, and how they still stand, so we can look into them and see ourselves. And if you ever come to New York, try walking past that gate. Stand still for a few seconds. Do not take a photo right away. Just look and listen to your own feeling. Because sometimes history does not knock with noise. It knocks with a small silence, but strong enough to remind us time has not disappeared. It has only changed how it appears. If you want, leave a comment and tell me what you felt hearing this story. Do you see the Dakota as a symbol of survival, or as a symbol of closed doors? And if you like history told this way, with sources and with emotion, do not forget to subscribe. I will take you through other gates of the world, places where standing in front of them is enough to feel time breathing.